Hello, Dr. Tanya Bennett here. Now that we've finished reading Beloved, I imagine you will still have a few questions, as all of us do when we finish this novel. It can be really difficult to understand some of the choices that Morrison made in writing the novel. But I'd like to argue, and I hope you'll just hang in there with me, that Morrison knew exactly what she was doing, that she didn't accidentally do some things that were confusing, that didn't make sense. I think if you reread the novel over and over again, the way some of us have, you will start to see that everything that she did was intentional and that it was connected in a meaningful way to the overarching meanings of the novel. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think might be your questions. At least they have been questions that I've had, and also many other scholars have had. In fact, English professors talk about this novel among ourselves, and sometimes we argue about the meaning. As you can probably tell, if you're doing research on the novel and you're seeing people disagreeing sometimes about what's happening in certain parts of it. Your first question is likely, who is Beloved? Was she really the ghost of the baby that Sethe killed to save from slavery? The answer is yes, but also she's a lot more than that. Now, if you're the kind of person that thinks scientifically, you're thinking, wow, I don't think that's possible in the real world, that there could be a ghost. Well, this unrealistic factor doesn't really matter, in my opinion, because even if you only think of Beloved figuratively, if you just think of her as a sort of ghost in the imagination of, let's say, Sethe or the people in her community, she has the same meanings. She is, like Denver says, so much more than just the baby returned. She's the traumatic past that is in our subconscious, the subconsciousness of African Americans who are still trying to figure out what to do with that history, but really of all citizens of the United States. We're all trying to figure out what to do with that part of our history. Sethe is trying to reconcile with the past, and when she thinks that the baby has returned and has forgiven her, that is something that she clings to. She doesn't want to let go of that. Paul D has kind of a different experience with the past. He loses control in its presence. It still has a lot of control over him. And that's the scary thing about dealing with the traumatic past, that it can overtake you and it can keep you from being able to function in your present life. As we read at the very end of the novel, the past refuses to stay down. But it's also the kind of thing that we can't live our daily lives in the presence of, right? Because it's so heavy and so traumatic. Listen to this passage at the very end of the book. It was not a story to pass on. They forgot her like a bad dream after they made up their tales, shaped and decorated them. Those that saw her that day on the porch quickly and deliberately forgot her. It took longer for those who had spoken to her, lived with her, fallen in love with her, to forget until they realized that they couldn't remember or repeat a single thing she said, and began to believe that other than what they themselves were thinking, she hadn't said anything at all. So they're starting to think, did this just come out of my own head? Yes, possibly. It's just as important, though, whether she was only in their heads or she was a real ghost. The narrator says, so in the end, they forgot her too. Remembering seemed unwise. They never knew where or why she crouched or whose was the underwater face she needed like that. Where the memory of the smile under her chin might have been and was not, a latch latched and lichen attached its apple green bloom to the metal. What made her think her fingernails could open locks rain rained on? It was not a story to pass on. So they do forget her on some level. But as the story says, they don't know where she crouches. She can come back at any time. It's like somebody who's dealing with trauma. That trauma can come back to the surface at any time, and it is affecting us at all times, whether we're thinking of it consciously or not. It is part of who we are. The second question is, who are the men without skin? I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I'm going to offer my interpretation, which is consistent with what some other people think. The men without skin are white men. There are some actual slave narratives in existence of from people who were transported from Africa on slave ships. Olaudah Equiano, you may have read part or all of this slave narrative, says that when he was put on the slave ship, he didn't understand the language of almost anyone on the ship because he was captured with people from other tribes and they didn't all speak the same language. So they were very confused about what was happening to them, and it was incredibly frightening. They were shoved into the slave hold in the bottom of the boat. The conditions were horrific. They weren't even taken out to go to the bathroom. Some of them were vomiting, seasick, and they were all very scared. They were given very little to eat and drink. They didn't see the light of day. There was no fresh air. The air became stench-filled because there were people who died and their bodies were not taken out of the hold. The kidnapped people just lay there among the others that were chained to them, and some had to endure being chained to a dead person who was decomposing. Their perception of white men, many had not seen white men before, and so when they saw these white men, they thought they seemed really strange looking. So if you go back and you look at the parts of the novel where the men without skin are referred to, it makes sense that they are white men. At the very end, when Mr. Bodwin is coming to the house and Sethe thinks he's a school teacher returning, she says it's a man without skin approaching. So in this case, it's another white man. You may have wondered, who is the dead man on top of Beloved that she describes? And you can picture what it is she's describing. I think there are several ways to read this as well. One is that she's in a grave and she's under there with some other decomposing bodies, and that there's a literal dead man there with her. She says sometimes the people in her world there, in the spiritual world or in the decomposing world, that they are chewing and making noises. So it's possible that she's describing what it's like to be in a grave. But a much more meaningful perspective, I think, is that she's describing what it's like to be in the slave hold of the ship. There's a really confusing part of the novel, and there have been lots of scholars look at it and say, are you sure that that's what's going on? I think, though, that if you read it several times over, you'll begin to see that that's what she's doing there. Here's how she describes what's happening in that world. This is Beloved talking. She says, "Some who eat nasty themselves. I do not eat. The men without skin bring us their morning water, which is urine, to drink. We have none. At night I cannot see the dead man on my face. Daylight comes through the cracks. Daylight comes through the cracks and I can see he has locked eyes." She says, that small rats do not wait for us to sleep. Someone is thrashing, but there's no room to do it in. If we had more to drink, we could make tears. We cannot make sweat or morning water. So the men without skin bring us theirs. So in this case, it's the white men on the ship bringing urine for them to drink. One time they bring us sweet rocks to suck. We're all trying to leave our bodies behind. The man on my face has done it. It's hard to make yourself die forever. You sleep short and then return. In the beginning we could vomit. Now we do not. Now we cannot. His teeth are pretty white points. Someone is trembling. I could feel it over here. He is fighting hard to leave his body, which is a small bird trembling. There is no room to tremble, so he's not able to die. My own dead man is pulled away from my face. I miss his pretty white points. So what may be happening here, and what I'm suggesting, is that Beloved is not only the ghost of the baby, that Sethe killed specifically, but she's also the ghost of of our history. And in this case, she's embodying a person who came over on the ship in the slavehold on what we call the Middle Passage. So she is expressing her experience being one of those people. So this dead man who's on her face could therefore be a person who has actually died, who's in the hold with her, and she can only see when she can get a little glimpse of light there that, you know, maybe his eyes are open, and as she says, that they are fixed. I forget how she puts it, but they're locked is how she puts it. She also describes his pretty white points, his teeth. So what in the world is that? There were many tribes whose fellow members were captured and taken into slavery, and one traditional practice for some tribes, for example, several tribes of the Congo, was to file their teeth into sharp points. So the sharp pointed teeth, Beloved describes, suggest two meanings, as always, right? One is maybe the man who's died next to the person that she embodies on the slave ship actually has pointed teeth. But then we also have the teeth of the saw that was used to kill Beloved. She mentions the teeth over and over and over again. And she says about Sethe that she chewed and then took her face. So it could be the saw kind of doing the chewing. If you read it again with that in mind, you'll see that there's some association between the teeth, the chewing, and the loss of Beloved's face. And she says, I'm coming into pieces. She's almost decapitated in that moment when her mother takes the saw to her and kills her so that she won't have to go back under the authority of school teacher and be dehumanized in the ways that Sethe felt like she was dehumanized and that Paul D and all the other slaves were. If you go back and you read through that very poetic section where the women of 124 are talking to each other in that sort of fluid subconscious narrative, you'll see some allusions that are affiliated with the slave ship. The men without skin, the dead man, and the white pointed teeth are meaningful, A, as details of Beloved's death and her time in the grave, and B, as elements of the journey across the ocean in the hold of the slave ship, what we now call the Middle Passage. So Morrison uses this parallel to develop her theme about the need to grapple with traumatic history, even if it seems to be dead and buried. Another persistent question: why are there so many comparisons of Sethe to a four-legged animal, a cow in particular? What is Morrison doing with that? Here are some of the occurrences in the novel where that comparison is developed. The Sweet Home Boys, the Pauls, Sixo, and Hallie, they had sex with cows. They were all adolescents. There were no women on the farm available to them. They were just human beings who had a sex drive. And as an outlet, they took to the cows. After Sethe came there, they continued to do that so that they would not spoil her innocence. Although their practice of having sex with cows seems animalistic, they choose to honor Sethe's humanity and her relative innocence. They give her the chance to choose who she would like to have as her husband. They act as humans in that way. They treat her like a human. It's not that I sanction bestiality. I'm not sure about the poor cows in that situation, but I don't think Morrison even makes a judgment about it. The narrator just states it. School teachers' nephews, on the other hand, instead of treating Sethe as somebody who would have some kind of innocence and who might be able to make choices of her own, treat her like the cow. They drink her milk, they hold her down, they think it's funny. They think of her as an animal, as you see in their journals, where they're having to make the lists of which parts of Sethe are animal and which parts seem human. So she's definitely dehumanized by school teachers' system of thought. She is stock for school teacher.